The morning of May 3rd, 1945, somewhere east of the Rhine River in what remained of Nazi Germany, a German Generalmajor stood in the ruins of what had once been a Wehrmacht command post. The building's roof had collapsed 2 days earlier during an American fighter-bomber attack. Now, through the jagged hole in the ceiling, he watched the sky. Wave after wave of aircraft passed overhead. Silver fighters with distinctive radial engines. He counted them. 12, 24, 48, 72. Formation after formation, stacked at different altitudes, flying east toward what remained of German territory, Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. American fighter bombers carrying bombs and rockets, hunting for anything German that still moved. The Generalmajor had commanded Luftwaffe fighter units earlier in the war. He knew aircraft. He knew what he was seeing. And he knew what it meant. The count reached 100, then 150. The formations kept passing. By the time the sky finally cleared, he estimated he had watched more than 300 American fighters fly overhead in less than 2 hours, 300 aircraft, in a single morning, over a single sector of the front. The Luftwaffe could not have mustered 300 serviceable fighters in all of Germany that day. Perhaps not even 200, and those few aircraft that remained had no fuel to fly them, no experienced pilots to fly them, and nowhere safe to take off from. Every airfield in Western Germany was within range of American fighters. Every runway was cratered, every hangar destroyed, every fuel dump burned. The war was over. Germany had lost. The Generalmajor had known this for months. But watching those endless formations of American fighters that morning, he understood something he had not fully grasped before. Germany had not simply lost the war. German air power had been systematically annihilated. The Luftwaffe, which 5 years earlier had dominated the skies over Poland, France, and Britain, had ceased to exist as a fighting force. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The American aircraft he watched that morning were not even the best fighters the United States had produced. The P-47 Thunderbolt was heavier and less maneuverable than the P-51 Mustang. It had shorter range than the Mustang. It could not climb as fast or turn as tightly. Yet the Americans had built over 15,000 of them. 15,683 Thunderbolts manufactured between 1941 and 1945. More than any other American fighter of the war. And every single one of those aircraft represented something Germany could not match: industrial capacity, the ability to produce weapons in overwhelming numbers, the ability to replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them, the ability to train pilots, stockpile fuel, build airfields, and sustain operations month after month after month until the enemy simply had nothing left to fight with. The P-47 had been designed in 1940 by Alexander Kartveli at Republic Aviation. The prototype flew in May 1941. The first production model was delivered to the United States Army Air Forces in March 1942. By April 1943, P-47s were flying combat missions over Europe. That was how fast American industry moved, from drawing board to combat deployment in less than 2 years. The aircraft was massive for a single-engine fighter. It weighed 4,900 pounds empty. Fully loaded with fuel, ammunition, and bombs, a P-47 could weigh over 8 tons. It was the heaviest single-engine fighter in operation during the war. The fuselage was thick and bulky. The nose was enormous, housing a Pratt & Whitney R2, 1,800 double Wasp radial engine that produced over 2,000 horsepower. German pilots who encountered P-47s early in the war called them easy targets. The aircraft looked clumsy. It seemed too heavy to be agile. Initial combat reports from Luftwaffe pilots suggested the Thunderbolt could not turn with a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190. But those reports were misleading. The P-47 was not designed to dogfight at low altitude. It was designed for high-altitude operations where its turbocharger gave it exceptional performance above 25,000 feet. At altitude, The P-47 was fast. Maximum speed exceeded 430 miles per hour at 30,000 feet. The aircraft could dive faster than anything the Germans flew. And most importantly, it could absorb incredible amounts of battle damage and still bring its pilot home. The radial engine was air-cooled. There was no liquid cooling system to puncture, no radiator to destroy. German cannon shells could blow cylinders off the engine, and the aircraft would keep flying. The cockpit was armoured. The fuel tanks were self-sealing. The airframe was built like a tank. P-47 pilots who crash-landed their aircraft often walked away from wrecks that would have killed anyone flying a lighter fighter. But the P-47's real strength was not its ability to fight German fighters. The aircraft's real strength was its versatility. It could carry bombs. It could carry rockets. It could strafe ground targets with 850 caliber machine guns that fired a combined rate of over 100 rounds per second. And it could do all of this while still maintaining enough performance to defend itself against enemy fighters. By June 1944, the P-47 had become the primary American fighter bomber in Europe. The aircraft flew more sorties than any other American fighter. It destroyed more enemy vehicles, more locomotives, more tanks, more trucks, and more German installations than any other aircraft in the American arsenal. The 9th Air Force, which supported American ground forces advancing through France, Belgium, and Germany, flew almost exclusively P-47s. 16 fighter groups operating hundreds of aircraft. Every day, weather permitting, those groups launched missions against German targets, rail yards, supply columns, troop concentrations, tank formations. Anything that moved was attacked. German ground forces learned to fear the sound of P-47 engines. The distinctive roar of the R2800 radial was unmistakable. When German soldiers heard that sound, they scattered. They abandoned their vehicles and ran for cover, because they knew what was coming. 850 caliber machine guns, 500-pound bombs, 5-inch rockets, and there was no effective defense. German anti-aircraft guns could shoot down individual aircraft, but they could not stop the attacks. More planes always came. The statistics were staggering. From D-Day, on June 6, 1944, until VE Day, on May 8, 1945, P-47 Thunderbolts claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. The numbers strain credulity. But multiple independent sources confirmed the scale of destruction. American fighter bombers systematically dismantled German transportation infrastructure and combat capability. One German officer later described it as being attacked by an aerial hurricane. Everywhere you turned, American aircraft. They controlled the sky absolutely. They flew when they wanted. They attacked what they wanted, and German forces could do nothing to stop them. The transformation had not happened overnight. In 1942 and early 1943, the Luftwaffe still controlled German airspace. American bomber formations suffered terrible losses. In October 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 B-17 bombers in a single raid on Schweinfurt. 20% of the attacking force shot down in one mission. The losses were unsustainable, but American industry responded. More bombers were built, more fighters were produced, better tactics were developed, long-range fighter escorts were deployed. By mid-1944, American fighters were appearing over German cities in overwhelming numbers. The Luftwaffe tried to fight back. German pilots were brave, German aircraft were technologically sophisticated, but they were outnumbered 5-1, sometimes 10-1. And every aircraft the Germans lost was irreplaceable. Germany's aircraft production actually peaked in 1944. German factories built more fighters in 1944 than in any previous year, but the aircraft were useless without trained pilots to fly them and fuel to power them. And both pilots and fuel were in critically short supply. Training a fighter pilot properly required hundreds of hours of flight time. German pilot training had been reduced to bare minimums by late 1944. Replacement pilots arrived at frontline units with less than 200 hours total flight time. Many had never fired their guns in training. They were sent into combat against American pilots who had 500, 600, even 1,000 hours of experience. The results were predictable. German pilots were shot down on their first or second missions. The experienced German aces who survived kept flying, kept fighting, and kept dying. By January 1945, the Luftwaffe had lost most of its veteran pilots. The fighters they flew were being flown by teenagers with inadequate training who did not survive their first encounters with American pilots. Fuel was an even more critical problem. German synthetic fuel production had been systematically targeted by American bombers throughout 1944. By autumn of that year, fuel production had dropped to a fraction of what was needed. Luftwaffe units could not fly training missions. They could not fly regular patrols. They had to conserve fuel for emergency defensive operations, and even those operations were increasingly impossible. On January 1, 1945, the Luftwaffe made one final attempt to regain air superiority, Operation Bodenplatte. The operation called for nearly every operational German fighter to attack Allied airfields in Belgium, the Netherlands, and northern France in a single coordinated strike. The goal was to destroy Allied aircraft on the ground and buy time for German ground forces in the Battle of the Bulge. Over 1,000 German aircraft took off that morning. They achieved some tactical surprise. Nearly 500 Allied aircraft were destroyed or damaged on the ground. But the operation was a strategic disaster. The Luftwaffe lost over 200 aircraft and, more critically, over 200 irreplaceable pilots. Many were killed by friendly fire because German anti-aircraft gunners had not been informed of the operation. The remaining pilots returned to airfields that had no fuel for future operations. After Bodenplatte, the Luftwaffe essentially ceased offensive operations. The aircraft that survived sat on airfields, grounded for lack of fuel. The pilots who survived had no aircraft to fly. Production continued in underground factories, but the new aircraft could not reach operational units because transportation had broken down. Germany was being strangled from the air. By May 1945, the situation had become absurd. Germany still had hundreds of aircraft, but most were hidden in forests, camouflaged under trees, unusable because there was no fuel and nowhere safe to operate them from. American fighters had free rein over German territory. They flew wherever they wanted, attacked whatever they saw, and suffered minimal losses. The German Generalmajor, who stood watching American formations on May 3rd, understood all of this. He had watched the Luftwaffe decline month by month. He had received the reports. He knew the numbers. But watching those formations pass overhead that morning made the defeat visceral in a way statistics never could. 300 aircraft, in one sector, in one morning, and this was just routine operations. This was not a major offensive. This was just normal American air activity. Somewhere else over Germany, other formations were attacking other targets. The Americans had so many aircraft they could afford to fly hundreds of sorties every single day, even as the war was ending. He thought about the Messerschmitt, Me-262, jet fighter, Germany's technological marvel, the world's first operational jet fighter, faster than any Allied aircraft, nearly impossible to intercept when flown properly. Germany had built over 1,400 Me-262s, but they had accomplished almost nothing. Most never flew in combat. There was no fuel. There were no trained pilots. The airfields from which they operated were constantly under attack. The few Me-262s that did engage Allied bombers scored victories, but not enough to matter, not enough to change anything. Technology could not overcome industrial capacity. German engineering could not defeat American mass production. The Me-262 was a better aircraft than the P-47 in almost every measurable way. It was faster, more modern, more advanced. But for every Me-262 Germany built, America built 10 P-47s, and those 10 P-47s could operate from crewed forward airfields, required less maintenance, used less fuel, and were flown by adequately trained pilots who had enough flight hours to be competent. The General Major had tried to explain this to his superiors earlier in the war. He had argued that Germany was losing an attrition battle it could not win. He had provided statistics showing that American aircraft production was exceeding German production by ratios of 3-1, 4-1, eventually 5-1. He had been told that German quality would overcome American quantity. He had been told that German pilots were better trained. He had been told that new weapons would change the strategic balance. All of it had been nonsense, wishful thinking, denial of reality. German quality did not overcome American quantity. German pilots were not better trained, not after 1943, when the training program collapsed under attrition and fuel shortages. And the new weapons arrived too late and in too few numbers to change anything. The Americans had understood something fundamental about modern industrial warfare that Germany had missed. Victory did not go to the side with the best weapons. Victory went to the side that could produce enough weapons to overwhelm the enemy through sheer volume. The Americans had built adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers. They had trained adequate pilots in overwhelming numbers. They had stockpiled adequate fuel and ammunition and spare parts in overwhelming numbers. And they had established a logistical system that could sustain those overwhelming numbers month after month until Germany ran out of everything. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not the best fighter aircraft of World War II. Most aviation historians would rank it below the P-51 Mustang, below the British Supermarine Spitfire, possibly below several other designs. But the P-47 was good enough, and there were 15,000 of them. That was what mattered. Good enough, produced in overwhelming numbers, supported by adequate logistics, flown by adequately trained pilots who had enough fuel to fly and enough ammunition to shoot. Germany had tried to win the war with excellence. America had won it with adequacy, multiplied by industrial scale. The result was the same as if America had fielded superior weapons. German forces were overwhelmed. German air power was annihilated. German transportation was destroyed. German industry was paralyzed. And German soldiers died by the hundreds of thousands because they had no air cover, no supplies, and no hope of reinforcement. The Generalmajor watched the last American formation disappear to the east. The sky was empty again, silent. He wondered what those pilots were thinking as they flew over Germany that morning. Did they understand what they represented? Did they grasp that their presence in German skies meant the complete collapse of German military power? Did they realize they were witnessing the end of the Luftwaffe as an institution? Probably not. To those American pilots, this was just another mission, another day of flying over enemy territory, searching for targets, dropping bombs, firing rockets, strafing anything that moved. They had been doing this for months. It had become routine. The Germans rarely fought back anymore. German anti-aircraft fire was sporadic and inaccurate. German fighters almost never appeared. The missions were dangerous because of the inherent risk of flying and combat, but the enemy was no longer a serious threat. That was the most damning assessment of all. The Luftwaffe had become irrelevant. American pilots no longer worried about German fighters. They worried about mechanical failures, about weather, about anti-aircraft fire, about mid-air collisions with other Allied aircraft. But German fighters? Those were not a significant concern anymore. There were so few of them left, and they appeared so infrequently, that American pilots rarely encountered them. The General Major turned away from the ruined building and walked toward his staff car. It was a Mercedes that had been requisitioned from a civilian family 3 weeks earlier. The Wehrmacht's own vehicles had all been destroyed or abandoned. Even general officers were driving. Civilian cars now. That was how complete the collapse had become. His driver, a Gefreiter who had been transferred from a panzer unit after his tank was destroyed, saluted. The young soldier looked exhausted. Everyone looked exhausted. Germany was running on fumes. The soldiers had not been paid in weeks. Many had not received proper rations in days. The supply system had completely broken down. American fighter bombers had destroyed every bridge, every rail line, every major road. Nothing moved in daylight. Everything had to be transported at night, and even then, the Americans flew night missions with increasing frequency. "Where are we going, Herr Generalmajor?" the driver asked. "West," the General Major replied, "toward American lines." The driver's eyes widened. "We are surrendering?" "The war is over," the General Major said. "Germany has lost. There is no point in continuing to fight." The driver nodded slowly. He did not seem surprised. Everyone knew the war was lost. The question was when the killing would finally stop. They drove west on roads cratered by bombs and rockets. Every few kilometers they passed burned-out vehicles, German trucks, German tanks, German artillery pieces, all destroyed from the air, all abandoned where they had been hit. There were no recovery vehicles to tow them away. There was no fuel to move them. They sat where they died, rusting monuments to German defeat. The General Major counted them as they drove. 17 destroyed vehicles in the first 10 kilometers, 23 in the next 10 kilometers. The numbers kept adding up. This was just one road. There were thousands of roads across Germany. All of them looked like this. Tens of thousands of destroyed vehicles. Maybe hundreds of thousands. The Americans had claimed to have destroyed 86,000 railroad cars and 68,000 trucks. Those numbers had seemed exaggerated when he first read them. Now, driving through the wreckage, he believed them. They passed through a small town that had been bombed 3 days earlier. The buildings were still smoking. Bodies lay in the streets. No one had buried them yet. There were no emergency services anymore, no fire department, no police, no medical personnel. The people who survived the bombing had fled. Those who died were left where they fell. This is what defeat looks like, the General Major thought. This is what happens when air power is used systematically to destroy a nation's ability to function. The Americans had not needed to invade every German city. They did not need to fight for every town. They simply flew over Germany day after day, destroying everything that moved, everything that mattered, everything that kept a modern industrial society functioning. And when there was nothing left to destroy, Germany collapsed. The Luftwaffe had been the first thing to collapse. It had been the strongest military force in the world in 1940. German fighter pilots had dominated the skies over Poland, over France, over the early battles on the Eastern Front. The Luftwaffe had terrorized London during the Blitz. It had destroyed thousands of Soviet aircraft in the opening weeks of Operation Barbarossa. It had been feared and respected by every Allied nation. But by 1943, the Luftwaffe was already in decline. The Battle of Britain had failed to achieve air superiority over England. The Eastern Front had consumed men and aircraft at unsustainable rates. The Mediterranean campaign had stretched resources thin. And the arrival of American air power in Europe had created a two-front air war that Germany could not win. The General Major had watched it happen. He had been a major commanding a fighter squadron in France in 1940. He had flown Messerschmitt Bf 109s against French and British aircraft. His squadron had achieved air superiority easily. The Allied aircraft they encountered were obsolete or poorly flown. German pilots shot them down in large pilots bad numbers with minimal losses. By 1942, he had been promoted to Oberstleutnant and given command of a fighter wing on the Eastern Front. The situation there was more difficult. Soviet pilots were brave and increasingly competent. Soviet aircraft were crude but effective. The fighting was intense. But the Luftwaffe maintained control of the air over most of the front. German ground forces could operate with reasonable confidence that they would have air support when needed. By 1943, he had been promoted again to Oberst and assigned to command a fighter wing defending Germany against American bomber raids. That was when he realized Germany was going to lose the war. The Americans flew in formations of hundreds of bombers, protected by hundreds of fighters. The Luftwaffe could intercept them. German pilots could shoot down American aircraft. But the Americans kept coming. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The losses the Luftwaffe inflicted on American formations were replaced within days. The losses Germany suffered were irreplaceable. He had reported this to higher headquarters. He had explained that Germany was losing an attrition battle. He had requested more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel. He had been told that production was increasing, that new weapons were being developed, that the strategic situation would improve. None of it happened. Production increased but not fast enough. New weapons were developed but arrived too late. The strategic situation deteriorated month by month. By 1944, he had been promoted to General Major and assigned to a staff position coordinating fighter operations across Western Germany. That was when he saw the complete picture. The reports from every sector told the same story. German fighter units were being ground down through attrition. Pilot losses exceeded replacement rates. Aircraft losses exceeded production rates. Fuel consumption exceeded supply rates. Every metric pointed toward collapse. He had written a detailed assessment in August 1944. The assessment concluded that the Luftwaffe would cease to be an effective fighting force by early 1945 unless drastic changes were made. He had recommended withdrawing all fighter units from the Eastern Front to defend Germany. He had recommended suspending all offensive operations to conserve resources. He had recommended negotiating a ceasefire before Germany lost everything. The assessment had been rejected. He had been reprimanded for defeatism. He had been told that Germany would win through superior will and fighting spirit. He had been ordered to never submit such pessimistic reports again. 3 months later, everything he predicted had come true. The Luftwaffe had collapsed. German fighter units could no longer mount effective defensive operations. American bombers flew over Germany with minimal opposition. American fighters ranged across German territory attacking anything that moved. German ground forces advanced or retreated without air cover. German cities burned without protection. Germany was being destroyed from the air, and there was nothing the Luftwaffe could do to stop it. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The General Major and his driver reached the outskirts of another town. American troops had taken it 2 days earlier. White sheets hung from windows, improvised flags of surrender. German civilians stood in the streets, watching the Mercedes approach. Their faces showed no emotion, no anger, no fear. Just exhaustion and relief that the fighting had moved past them. An American patrol stopped the Mercedes at a checkpoint. Young soldiers with rifles surrounded the car. One soldier, a sergeant with 3 stripes on his sleeve, approached the driver's window. "Get out of the vehicle," the sergeant said, in accented but understandable German. The General Major and his driver complied. They stood with their hands visible while American soldiers searched the car. "I am General Major of the Luftwaffe," the General Major said in English. "I wish to surrender myself and my command." The sergeant looked at him carefully. "You speak English?" "Yes. I studied at Oxford before the war." The sergeant called for an officer. A lieutenant appeared within minutes. The lieutenant was young, perhaps 23 or 24 years old. He looked at the General Major's uniform and insignia. "You're a general?" the lieutenant asked. "Yes. General Major. Equivalent to your Brigadier General." "What command?" "Fighter operations in this sector. Approximately 1,200 men, most of them ground personnel. No operational aircraft. Where are your men?" "Scattered. Some are here, in this area. Some have already surrendered to your forces. Some have deserted and gone home. The unit no longer exists as a functional organization." The lieutenant nodded. He seemed unsurprised. "All right. You'll be transported to a collection point for processing. Your driver too." "That is acceptable," the General Major said. They waited while the Americans arranged transportation. More prisoners arrived. Wehrmacht soldiers, SS troops, Luftwaffe personnel, all surrendering, all looking exhausted and defeated. No one resisted, no one argued. The war was over, and everyone knew it. A truck arrived to take them to a prisoner collection point. The General Major climbed into the back with 24 other German prisoners. The truck drove west, deeper into American-controlled territory. Through the open back of the truck, he could see the sky. More P-47s passed overhead. A formation of 16 aircraft flying east, then another formation, then another. The Americans were still flying missions, even though organized German resistance had effectively ended. They were making sure. They were finishing the job. They were destroying everything that remained of German military capability, so that Germany could never threaten anyone again. The prisoner collection point was a field outside a small town. Thousands of German prisoners sat in groups, guarded by American soldiers. Medical personnel were treating wounded. Chaplains were distributing food and water. It was organized chaos, but it was organized. The Americans knew how to process prisoners. They had been doing it for months as German armies collapsed across Europe. The General Major was separated from the other prisoners and taken to an interrogation area. An American intelligence officer, a captain with a college education evident in his manner, conducted the interview. "Rank and name?" the captain asked. "General Major," the General Major replied, giving his name and service number. "What was your position?" "Coordinating fighter operations for Western Sector Defense. How many aircraft did you have?" "On paper or in reality?" "In reality. As of yesterday, approximately 20 operational aircraft. Perhaps 30 more that could be made operational if we had mechanics, parts, and fuel. We have none of those things." The captain made notes. "What happened to the rest of your aircraft?" "Destroyed. Some shot down in combat, some destroyed on the ground by your fighter bombers, some abandoned for lack of fuel or parts. The majority of our losses since January have been non-combat operational losses. Aircraft that broke down and could not be repaired, aircraft that ran out of fuel and were abandoned, aircraft that were hidden in forests and could not be recovered." "When did you know the war was lost?" "Personally. In August 1943, when I realized American production exceeded German production by factors we could not match." "When did the Luftwaffe know the war was lost?" "Officially? Never. Unofficially? Most experienced commanders knew by mid-1944 that we could not win. The question was, how long until we lost completely? What was the turning point?" "Multiple turning points. The Battle of Britain failed in 1940. That was the first major failure. Operation Barbarossa failed to destroy Soviet air power in 1941. That created a sustained two-front air war we could not win. American entry into the war in 1941 meant we would eventually face overwhelming industrial capacity. The introduction of long-range American fighter escorts in 1944 meant we could no longer defend German airspace effectively. Each of these failures was compounded by the next. What about German jet aircraft? Too late. Too few. Inadequate infrastructure to support them. The Me-262 was technologically superior to your aircraft, but technology does not win wars. Production capacity wins wars. Training capacity wins wars. Logistical sustainability wins wars. We had better technology. You had everything else." The captain continued, asking questions for another hour. Technical questions about Luftwaffe, organization, tactics, equipment. Strategic questions about German decision-making and planning. The General Major answered everything honestly. There was no point in deception. The war was over. Germany had lost. Nothing, he said, could change that. Eventually, the captain closed his notebook. "Thank you for your cooperation. You'll be transported to a POW camp for the duration. Treatment will be in accordance with Geneva Conventions." "I understand," the General Major said. "Before you go," the captain said, "I have a question that's not part of the official interrogation. Personal curiosity." "Go ahead. You studied at Oxford. You speak perfect English. You clearly understand industrial warfare and strategic planning. How did Germany think it could win this war?" The General Major was quiet for a moment. "That is a complicated question. I have time. Germany thought it could win through speed and decisiveness. The strategy was to achieve quick victories before opponents could fully mobilize. It worked against Poland. It worked against France. It nearly worked against Britain. but it failed against the Soviet Union. And once America entered the war, the strategic calculation changed completely. Germany was fighting a long war against opponents with superior industrial capacity. Victory became impossible, but by then the political leadership could not admit failure, so the war continued. Did you try to tell them? Many of us tried. We were ignored. The political leadership believed willpower could overcome material disadvantage. They were wrong. The captain nodded. Thank you. That's helpful context. The General Major was escorted back to the prisoner holding area. He sat on the ground with other German officers. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. They all knew what had happened. They had all watched Germany's military power disintegrate over the past year. An Oberst from a panzer unit sat next to him. We lost because of your Luftwaffe's failure, the Oberst said, bitterly. If we had air cover, we could have stopped the American advance. The General Major looked at him. We lost because American industry produced more weapons than Germany could destroy. The Luftwaffe failed because we faced 20 American aircraft for every German aircraft. Our pilots were outnumbered, outproduced, and eventually overwhelmed. We did not fail through lack of courage or skill. We failed because the strategic situation was impossible. The Oberst said nothing. After a moment, he looked away. That evening, the prisoners were loaded onto trains for transport to permanent POW camps. The General Major found himself in a freight car with 40 other German officers. The train travelled west through the night. Through cracks in the wooden walls, he could see the German countryside passing by. Destroyed bridges, burned towns, abandoned equipment, the landscape of total defeat. A Luftwaffe major sat across from him. I recognize you, the major said. You commanded the defense, group for the sector I flew in. November last year. The General Major nodded. I remember. Your unit was based near Frankfurt. Yes. We flew Focke-Wulf 190Ds, good aircraft. We scored victories against American bombers. But there were always more bombers, always more fighters. We shot down 3, and 6 replaced them. We shot down 10, and 20 replaced them. It never ended. What was your worst day? The General Major asked. December 6th, 1944. We intercepted a formation of B-17s near Gießen. Over 300 bombers, maybe 400 American fighters escorting them. We had 18 Focke-Wulfs available to fly, 18 against 700. We attacked anyway. We shot down 4 bombers. We lost 11 aircraft. 6 pilots killed, 3 wounded, 2 captured. That was the day I knew we had already lost the war. The train continued west. At dawn, they crossed into Belgium. The landscape here was less damaged. Fewer destroyed buildings, fewer burned, vehicles. The Americans had taken this territory months earlier and had already begun rebuilding. Roads were being repaired, bridges were being reconstructed. Life was returning to normal. Germany would not recover so quickly. Germany had been systematically destroyed. Cities had been bombed into rubble. Industry had been wrecked. Transportation had been shattered. It would take years to rebuild, maybe decades. And this time, there would be no German military to threaten anyone. The Allies would make certain of that. The train reached the POW camp late that afternoon. It was a massive installation, acres of barbed wire enclosures filled with German prisoners, tens of thousands of men, maybe hundreds of thousands. All the remnants of German armies that had once conquered most of Europe. Now they sat in muddy fields, waiting to learn their fate. The General Major and the other officers were processed, names recorded, possessions confiscated, medical examinations conducted. Then they were assigned to barracks. The barracks were crude wooden structures, unheated, with straw mattresses and minimal sanitation. But they were adequate. The prisoners would survive. That night, lying on his straw mattress, the Generalmajor thought about the formations of P-47s he had watched 3 days earlier. 300 aircraft in one morning over one sector. Routine operations. Nothing special. Just another day of American air power systematically destroying what remained of German military capability. He thought about how the war might have ended differently. If Germany had negotiated peace after the fall of France, if Hitler had not invaded the Soviet Union, if Germany had focused on defense instead of conquest, if German leadership had understood the realities of industrial warfare, but none of that had happened. Germany had chosen conquest. Germany had invaded the Soviet Union. Germany had declared war on the United States. Germany had tried to win through military brilliance against opponents with vastly superior industrial capacity. And Germany had been crushed. The Luftwaffe's destruction was just one element of that crushing defeat. But it was the element the General Major understood best. He had watched it happen from the inside. He had seen German fighter pilots grow increasingly desperate as they faced impossible odds. He had seen aircraft production fail to keep pace with losses. He had seen training programs collapse under pressure. He had seen fuel supplies dwindle until aircraft could not fly. He had seen the entire structure of German air power disintegrate month by month until nothing remained. And he had seen the American response: more aircraft, more pilots, more fuel, more bombs, more missions, day after day after day. The Americans never stopped. They never ran short of resources. They never seemed to doubt that they would win. They just kept producing weapons and sending them into combat until Germany ran out of everything. The P-47 Thunderbolts symbolized that approach perfectly. It was not an elegant aircraft. It was not the fastest or the most maneuverable. But it was rugged, reliable, effective, and produced in overwhelming numbers. 15,000 aircraft, each one capable of destroying German targets, each one representing American industrial might, each one another nail in the coffin of German military power. A week after his capture, the General Major was interrogated again. A different American officer, a colonel from Army Air Forces Intelligence, wanted more detailed information about Luftwaffe operations. "I want to understand the German perspective on air power," the colonel said. "What did you think when you saw American formations over Germany in 1945? "I thought we had fundamentally misunderstood modern warfare," the General Major replied. "We thought wars were won through tactical excellence and operational art. You understood that wars are won through industrial production and logistical sustainability. Explain." "Germany trained excellent pilots. We designed sophisticated aircraft. We developed advanced tactics. But we could not produce enough aircraft to replace our losses. We could not train enough pilots to maintain unit strength. We could not synthesize enough fuel to maintain operations, so our excellence did not matter. Your adequacy, multiplied by overwhelming production, defeated our excellence." The colonel nodded. "Go on. Your P-47 is not as good as our Focke-Wulf 190D. Your pilots in 1944 were not as experienced as our pilots in 1940. But you had 10 P-47s for every Focke-Wulf. You had 10 adequately trained pilots for every German veteran. So you won, not through superiority of equipment or personnel, through superiority of numbers. Did German leadership understand this? Some did. Most did not. Or if they understood, they refused to accept the implications. Accepting the implications meant accepting that Germany could not win the war. That was politically unacceptable. So they continued fighting and hoping that something would change the strategic balance. Did anything come close to changing it? The jet fighters came closest. If we had deployed Me-262s in large numbers in 1943 instead of late 1944, they might have inflicted unsustainable losses on your bomber formations. But we did not have them in 43. When we finally deployed them, you had too many escort fighters. The jets could not operate effectively in that environment. What would you have done differently? Negotiated peace in 1940 after France fell. Germany had achieved everything Hitler claimed to want. Lebensraum in the East could have been pursued through diplomacy instead of conquest. War with Britain could have been avoided. War with the Soviet Union could have been avoided. War with America would never have happened. Germany would have remained a great power without destroying itself. But that didn't happen. No, Hitler wanted conquest, not security. So Germany kept fighting until it had nothing left to fight with. The interrogation continued for several hours. The colonel asked about specific aircraft, specific operations, specific tactical decisions. The general major answered everything. He had no reason to withhold information. The war was over. Germany would never threaten anyone again. The information he provided might help the Americans understand what happened. It might prevent future miscalculations. In July 1945, the General Major learned that Germany had formally surrendered on May 8th. The war in Europe was officially over. Japan was still fighting in the Pacific, but everyone knew Japan would lose too. Japan faced the same impossible situation Germany had faced. Inadequate industrial capacity against an opponent who could produce weapons in overwhelming numbers. The outcome was inevitable. The prisoners in the camp received news sporadically. Guard newspapers, occasional radio broadcasts. The information was limited but sufficient. They learned about the extent of German destruction. They learned about the Holocaust and the concentration camps. They learned about war crimes, trials being prepared. They learned that Germany would be occupied and divided among the Allied powers. The General Major thought about his role in all of this. He had been a professional military officer. He had followed orders. He had commanded fighter units defending Germany against Allied bombing. Was he a war criminal? He did not know. He had not committed atrocities. He had not ordered civilians killed. He had fought what he considered a legitimate defensive war. But Germany had started the war. Germany had invaded neutral countries. Germany had committed genocide. Did that make everyone who served in the German military complicit? He did not have answers. He suspected the Allies would decide those questions for him. In September 1945, the General Major was transferred to a different camp in France. This camp held senior officers being evaluated for potential war crimes, prosecution. He was interrogated again, this time by military lawyers who asked detailed questions about his service record, his orders, his knowledge of atrocities. He answered honestly. He had commanded fighter units. He had defended German airspace. He had never ordered or participated in crimes against civilians. He had never been involved in the Holocaust or other atrocities. His service had been purely military. After weeks of interrogation, the lawyers concluded he would not be prosecuted. His service record showed no involvement in war crimes. He had been a professional military officer fighting a defensive air war. That was not criminal under international law, even if Germany's broader conduct had been. He remained in the POW camp. The Americans said repatriation would take time. Germany was occupied. There was no German government to negotiate release of prisoners. Each prisoner would be evaluated individually and released when appropriate. For senior officers, that process could take years. The General Major did not mind. He was alive. Many of his colleagues were dead. He had food, shelter, and medical care. Life in the camp was tolerable, and he had time to think about what had happened and what it meant. He thought about the 300 P-47s he had watched fly overhead on May 3rd, 1945. 300 aircraft representing American industrial might. 300 aircraft demonstrating German defeat. 300 aircraft showing that modern warfare was decided not by tactical excellence or operational art, but by production capacity and logistical sustainability. That was the lesson of World War II. That was what Germany had failed to understand. Wars between industrial nations were won by the side that could produce more weapons, train more soldiers, and sustain operations longer. Tactical brilliance mattered, operational excellence mattered, but they did not matter as much as industrial capacity. Germany had lost because America could build 15,000 P-47s, while Germany struggled to keep a few hundred fighters operational. Germany had lost because American factories produced aircraft faster than Germany could destroy them. Germany had lost because American training programs produced pilots faster than Germany could kill them. Germany had lost because American logistics could sustain operations indefinitely, while German logistics collapsed. The Generalmajor was released from the POW camp in November 1946. He returned to what remained of Germany. The country was devastated. Cities were rubble. Industry was destroyed. Millions of people were dead or missing. The nation was divided among the occupying powers. It would take decades to recover. He settled in a small town that had been relatively undamaged by the war. He found work as a translator, using his English skills to help with the occupation administration. He lived quietly, trying to rebuild his life, trying to forget the war. But he never forgot the formations of P-47s flying overhead that morning in May 1945. 300 aircraft, routine operations. The complete and absolute dominance of American air power over German skies. The final, undeniable proof that the Luftwaffe had been destroyed and Germany had lost the war. In his later years, the former General Major wrote a memoir. It was never published. He wrote it for his own understanding, trying to make sense of what had happened. In the memoir, he reflected on German strategic failures and American strategic success. The Americans understood modern warfare, he wrote. They understood that production wins wars. They built adequate weapons in overwhelming numbers. They trained adequate personnel in overwhelming numbers. They established logistics that could sustain those overwhelming numbers indefinitely. We tried to counter their numbers with excellence, but excellence cannot defeat overwhelming numbers sustained over years. That is the fundamental lesson of the Second World War. That is why we lost. That is why the Luftwaffe was destroyed. He ended his memoir with a description of watching those P-47 formations on May 3, 1945. I stood in the ruins of a command post and counted them, he wrote. 300 aircraft in 2 hours, perhaps more. I lost count. They flew east toward what remained of Germany, searching for targets to destroy, and I knew, watching them, that the war was over. Not because Germany had surrendered, surrender came 5 days later, but because German military power had been annihilated. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist. German armies had no air cover. German transportation had no protection. Germany had been defeated from the air, systematically, and completely. Those 300 American fighters represented the end of German military aviation. They represented American industrial supremacy. They represented the future of warfare, and they represented German defeat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.